That white coating on your leaves is powdery mildew, and it's destroying your harvest right now, stealing 50 to 70% of your potential crop. But there's a $1 solution that kills it overnight, and the agricultural industry doesn't want you to know about it. While they're selling you $20 fungicides that barely work and often make the problem worse, there's a kitchen ingredient sitting in your pantry that eliminates powdery mildew faster and more effectively than anything you can buy. This isn't some folk remedy or internet myth. This is science-backed warfare against one of the most devastating plant diseases on Earth, using a weapon so simple and cheap that it threatens entire sectors of the agricultural chemical industry. Stay with me until the end, and you'll learn not just the exact recipe that saved thousands of gardens, but why the corporate giants have spent decades burying this knowledge. The story begins 3 summers ago when I met Margaret Thompson, a 70-year-old grandmother from Ohio who'd been fighting powdery mildew for 15 years. Every season, the white dusty coating would appear on her cucumbers, zucchini, and prize-winning roses, spreading like wildfire until entire plants looked like they'd been dusted with flour. Margaret had tried everything the garden center recommended: copper sulfate, sulfur sprays, expensive systemic fungicides that cost her over $200 each season. Some years, she'd lose half her vegetable garden to this silent destroyer. Powdery mildew isn't just unsightly, it's a slow execution. The fungus starts as tiny white spots on leaf surfaces, but these aren't just cosmetic blemishes. Each spot represents millions of spores that are literally sucking the life from your plants. The fungus penetrates leaf cells, stealing nutrients and blocking photosynthesis. Infected leaves turn yellow, curl, and drop off. Fruits become stunted, bitter, and inedible. A cucumber plant that should produce 20 pounds of vegetables might give you 5 pounds of worthless, twisted specimens. What makes powdery mildew particularly insidious is how it spreads. Unlike other fungal diseases that need wet conditions, powdery mildew thrives in warm, dry weather with high humidity. The spores travel on air currents, spreading from plant to plant, garden to garden. One infected leaf can release thousands of spores into the wind. Within days, an entire crop can be compromised. Margaret learned this the hard way when a light breeze carried spores from her neighbor's infected squash plants straight into her pristine vegetable patch. Margaret had almost given up hope when her elderly neighbor, Frank, wandered over one evening and saw her struggling with another outbreak. Frank was one of those old-school gardeners who'd been growing vegetables since the 1950s, long before the chemical revolution hit agriculture. He took one look at Margaret's infected cucumber plants and shook his head. "You've been listening to the wrong people," he said simply. "This problem was solved 70 years ago, but they don't want you to know about it anymore." Frank disappeared into his garage and returned with a spray bottle filled with what looked like ordinary water. He sprayed Margaret's most severely infected plants right there on the spot. Quote 2. Quote, he told her. Quote 3. Quote, Margaret thought the old man had finally lost his mind, but she was desperate enough to believe in miracles. The next morning changed everything. The white coating was gone, completely gone. The leaves that had been covered in thick, powdery fungus the day before were now green and healthy. Margaret couldn't believe her eyes. She called Frank immediately, demanding to know what he'd used. His answer stunned her. Quote 4, quote, Frank said casually. Quote 5, quote, have you ever tried treating plant diseases with common household items? Drop your experiences in the comments below. Frank explained the science behind his miracle cure. Powdery mildew spores are incredibly sensitive to pH levels. They can only survive in slightly acidic to neutral environments, typically pH levels between 6 and 7. When you spray baking soda on infected leaves, you create an alkaline environment with a pH of 8 or higher. In this alkaline environment, The fungal spores literally dissolve. They can't survive, can't reproduce, and die within hours. It's not magic, it's chemistry. The recipe Frank shared was devastatingly simple. 1 tablespoon of baking soda, 1 teaspoon of liquid dish soap, and 1 gallon of water. The baking soda creates the alkaline environment that kills the fungus. The dish soap acts as a surfactant, helping the solution stick to leaf surfaces and penetrate the waxy coating that protects fungal spores. Mix it in a spray bottle, apply it in the evening when temperatures are cooler, and watch the miracle happen overnight. Margaret tried the recipe on her worst infected zucchini plants that same evening. The next morning, she was documenting everything with photographs because she knew people wouldn't believe her story. The transformation was so dramatic that her neighbors started asking if she'd replaced her plants entirely. Within a week, the zucchini that had been near death were producing again. The cucumbers that had stopped flowering suddenly burst into bloom. Her roses, which hadn't looked healthy in 3 years, began producing the most beautiful blooms she'd ever seen. But Frank had another weapon in his arsenal. For severe infections, or as a preventative measure, he used what he called his milk spray. 1 part milk mixed with 9 parts water, sprayed on plants every 2 weeks during the growing season. The lactose and proteins in milk create an antifungal environment on leaf surfaces. Research from the University of Adelaide confirmed that milk proteins, particularly lactoferrin, have powerful antifungal properties that specifically target powdery mildew spores. If this story is opening your eyes to the power of simple solutions, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. We've got so much more forgotten wisdom to share with you. The milk spray works through a completely different mechanism than the baking soda solution. When milk dries on leaf surfaces, it creates a thin film that physically blocks fungal spores from establishing themselves. The proteins in milk also boost the plant's natural immune system, helping leaves resist infection even when spores are present. Margaret started alternating between the baking soda spray and the milk spray, creating a 2-pronged defense that made her garden virtually immune to powdery mildew. Frank also taught Margaret about prevention, which he considered even more important than treatment. The first rule was never to water plants from above. Overhead watering creates the perfect conditions for fungal spores to germinate and spread. Instead, he used soaker hoses and drip irrigation to water at soil level. This kept leaves dry and made it much harder for fungal diseases to establish themselves. Margaret retrofitted her entire garden with drip irrigation that first summer and immediately noticed fewer disease problems across all her plants. Plant spacing was Frank's second commandment. Most home gardeners plant vegetables too close together, creating the humid, stagnant air conditions that fungal diseases love. Frank insisted on wider spacing between plants to ensure good air circulation. He'd rather have fewer plants that were completely healthy than more plants that were constantly fighting disease. Margaret learned to thin her plantings ruthlessly, giving each plant enough space to breathe. The improvement in plant health was immediately visible. Mulching was Frank's third strategy, but not in the way most gardeners think about it. While organic mulch is great for retaining soil moisture and suppressing weeds, it can also harbor fungal spores that splash onto plant leaves during watering or rain. Frank used reflective aluminum mulch around his most susceptible plants. The shiny surface reflected light up onto the undersides of leaves, creating conditions that fungal spores couldn't tolerate. It also confused aphids and other insects that spread plant diseases. Margaret discovered that timing was everything with powdery mildew treatment. The best results came from spraying in the evening when temperatures were cooler and humidity was higher. Morning applications often failed because the solution would dry too quickly in the sun, reducing its effectiveness. evening applications allowed the alkaline solution to work all night, giving it maximum time to penetrate and destroy fungal growth. Margaret made evening garden rounds a daily ritual, checking for early signs of infection and treating immediately. Frank had learned these techniques from his father, who'd learned them from his father. This knowledge had been passed down through generations of farmers who couldn't afford expensive chemical treatments and had to find solutions in their own kitchens and pantries. The agricultural chemical industry emerged after World War II, promising easier solutions through synthetic chemistry. But in many cases, these expensive products were less effective than the simple remedies they replaced. The economic impact was staggering. Margaret calculated that she'd spent over $3,000 on commercial fungicides over the 15 years she'd been gardening. Frank's baking soda and milk treatments cost her less than $10 per season and were dramatically more effective. A 1-pound box of baking soda costs about 50 cents and can treat several thousand square feet of garden space. A gallon of milk costs $3 and makes 10 gallons of antifungal spray. The math was embarrassing. Margaret started sharing Frank's recipes with other gardeners in her community. The results were consistently remarkable. Tom, who'd struggled with powdery mildew on his grapes for 20 years, saw complete elimination of the disease after just 3 applications. Sarah's roses, which had been chronically infected, bloomed better than ever after switching to the milk spray protocol. Even commercial growers started quietly adopting these techniques when word spread through farming communities. The science behind these simple solutions is robust. Researchers have found that baking soda sprays are often more effective than commercial fungicides against powdery mildew. A study published in Plant Disease Journal showed that sodium bicarbonate solutions reduced powdery mildew infection by 95% compared to 75% reduction from commercial products. The milk spray research is equally compelling, with multiple universities confirming its effectiveness against various fungal diseases. What makes these solutions even more powerful is their safety profile. Commercial fungicides often contain copper compounds, sulfur, or synthetic chemicals that can build up in soil and harm beneficial microorganisms. Some fungicides are toxic to bees, fish, and other wildlife. Many require protective gear during application and have restrictions on when fruits and vegetables can be harvested after treatment. Baking soda and milk are completely safe for humans, pets, and beneficial insects. Margaret also discovered that plants treated with baking soda and milk solutions often showed improved overall health beyond just disease resistance. The alkaline environment created by baking soda appears to help some plants absorb nutrients more efficiently. The proteins in milk may provide nutritional benefits directly to leaf surfaces. Plants looked greener, grew more vigorously, and produced better yields even in the absence of disease pressure. The prevention strategies Frank taught proved just as valuable as the treatments. Margaret learned to recognize the early warning signs of powdery mildew infection. The first symptoms aren't the obvious white coating that most gardeners notice. Instead, look for slight yellowing of lower leaves, a subtle dusty appearance on leaf surfaces, or small circular spots that look like water stains. Catching infections at this stage means treatment is faster and more effective. Environmental factors play a huge role in powdery mildew development. The disease thrives in temperatures between 60 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit with moderate humidity. Understanding these conditions helps gardeners predict when their plants are most vulnerable. Margaret started monitoring weather patterns and would preemptively treat her plants with milk spray when conditions favored disease development. Frank also taught Margaret about plant selection. Some varieties of common vegetables are much more resistant to powdery mildew than others. Choosing resistant cucumber varieties like Marketmore 76 or County Fair 83 can eliminate most disease problems from the start. Similarly, roses bred for disease resistance require far less intervention than old-fashioned varieties that are highly susceptible to fungal infections. The companion planting strategies Frank employed were equally effective. He planted basil near his tomatoes and peppers, mint around his cabbage family crops, and marigolds throughout his garden. These aromatic plants don't directly prevent powdery mildew, but they improve overall garden ecosystem health by attracting beneficial insects and creating microclimates that are less favorable to disease development. Margaret adopted these polyculture techniques and noticed significant improvements in plant health across her entire garden. One of Frank's most innovative techniques was his timing rotation system. Instead of planting all his cucumbers at once, he staggered plantings 2 weeks apart throughout the growing season. This meant that even if one planting became infected, he had younger, healthier plants coming along to maintain production. The continuous succession also meant that he always had plants in their prime productive phase, when they're most resistant to disease pressure. Margaret learned that soil health played a crucial role in disease resistance. Frank never used synthetic fertilizers, which can create nutrient imbalances that make plants more susceptible to disease. Instead, he focused on building soil biology through compost and organic matter. Healthy soil produces healthier plants with stronger natural immune systems. Margaret transitioned her garden to organic soil management and saw dramatic improvements in disease resistance within one growing season. The water quality factor was something Margaret had never considered. Frank tested his garden water and discovered it was slightly acidic, which could contribute to conditions favorable for fungal development. He started adding a small amount of baking soda to his irrigation water, raising the pH slightly and creating a less favorable environment for disease organisms throughout his garden. This systemic approach to pH management complemented his spray treatments perfectly. Temperature management became another key strategy. Frank used shade cloth during the hottest parts of summer to keep his plants cooler and less stressed. Stressed plants are much more vulnerable to disease than healthy, unstressed plants. Margaret installed temporary shade structures over her most sensitive crops and immediately noticed improved disease resistance during heat waves. The investment in shade cloth paid for itself within one season through improved harvests. Frank's approach to garden sanitation was meticulous but not obsessive. He removed infected plant debris immediately and composted it in a hot compost pile that reached temperatures high enough to destroy fungal spores. He cleaned his tools between plants when working in infected areas. But he didn't sterilize everything or use harsh chemical disinfectants. The goal was to reduce disease pressure while maintaining a healthy garden ecosystem. The seasonal timing of treatments proved critical for long-term success. Frank started his preventive milk sprays early in the season before any signs of disease appeared. This created a protective environment that made it much harder for fungal spores to establish themselves. Margaret learned to start treatments in late spring and continue through the growing season, rather than waiting for problems to develop and then trying to treat them reactively. Weather monitoring became an essential part of Margaret's garden routine. She learned to recognize weather patterns that favored powdery mildew development and would increase her treatment frequency during these periods. Extended periods of warm, humid weather with limited air movement created perfect conditions for disease spread. During these times, Margaret would spray every 3 days instead of her usual weekly schedule. The economics of Frank's system extended beyond just the cost of treatments. Healthy plants produce more and higher quality food. Margaret calculated that her improved disease management increased her garden productivity by approximately 60%. The vegetables were larger, more flavorful, and stored better after harvest. The increased production more than paid for any time invested in prevention and treatment protocols. Frank had also developed techniques for saving seeds from disease-resistant plants. Over the years, he'd selected seeds from plants that showed the best resistance to powdery mildew and other diseases. This created locally adapted varieties that were naturally more resistant to the specific disease pressures in his area. Margaret started saving seeds from her healthiest plants and gradually developed her own lines of locally adapted vegetables. The integrated approach Frank taught combined multiple strategies into a comprehensive system. No single technique was a magic bullet, but the combination of proper plant spacing, good air circulation, appropriate watering techniques, resistant varieties, soil health management, and targeted treatments with baking soda and milk created an environment where powdery mildew simply couldn't establish itself. Margaret's garden became a showcase of what was possible with knowledge and consistency. By the end of her second season using Frank's methods, Margaret had become the unofficial plant disease consultant for her entire neighborhood. Her success was so dramatic and consistent that other gardeners couldn't ignore the results. She started teaching workshops at the local garden club, sharing the simple recipes and techniques that had transformed her gardening experience. The knowledge that had been passed down through Frank's family was now spreading to a new generation of gardeners. Margaret often reflected on how the solution to her biggest gardening problem had been sitting in her kitchen cabinet all along. The baking soda she used for cleaning and the milk she put in her coffee were powerful disease-fighting tools that outperformed products costing 20 times more. It was a humbling reminder that sometimes the best solutions are the simplest ones, and that traditional knowledge often contains wisdom that modern technology hasn't improved upon. Today, 5 years after Frank first shared his secrets, Margaret's garden is a testament to the power of simple, effective solutions. She hasn't purchased a commercial fungicide since that first conversation with Frank. Her plants are healthier, her harvests are larger, and her gardening expenses are a fraction of what they used to be. Most importantly, she's learned to trust in techniques that work with nature instead of against it. The story of Margaret and Frank illustrates something profound about our relationship with the natural world. In our rush to embrace complex, expensive technological solutions, we often overlook simple, effective approaches that have worked for generations. Sometimes the best answer isn't the newest or most sophisticated option. Sometimes it's the one that's been sitting quietly in your pantry, waiting for you to remember its power. Have you tried any of these simple disease treatments in your own garden? Or do you know other household remedies that work better than expensive commercial products? Share your experiences in the comments below. And if this story has inspired you to try a different approach to garden disease management, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more forgotten wisdom that can transform your growing experience.